pretty frequent question we receive from newer testers is how do we go about writing email validation test cases? As you know, validation of email addresses is a critical part of most any application. In this tutorial, we will show you how to analyze the requirements, do the necessary research, create the email validation scenarios, and then finally execute them. By following this tutorial, you will be able to write your own very effective and thorough email validation test cases to ensure that your application's user input is properly validated. So let's get started by creating your free AccelaTest account so you can follow along and finish your first test case. The link to AccelaTest is in the description below. So before jumping into creating the actual test cases, we first have to analyze some requirements. This is part of our job as testers. So for this demo, I created a very simple story out here to validate the email addresses. Must be entered in the expected format of username at domain name with top level domain, and then to validate any error messages that are thrown when invalid data is entered. Like I said, this is a very basic acceptance criteria for a story, but this is an example of something you might see out in the real world. So before we actually get into testing and creating those test cases, we first have to analyze these requirements. So say that we don't really know what makes a username or a domain name with top-level domain. We'd have to go gain this expertise. So this might be asking a coworker about this functionality. Another really good resource, especially for this sort of test case, might be to consult the internet, which is what I did. So as we could see here on this article on Never Bounce, it's about how to correctly format your email addresses. This is one of the first results that was returned in Google, which means that it probably has pretty good authority. But this is how we would go about identifying what test cases we need to create. So what I like to do whenever I am going about creating my scenarios is open up a notepad, and then I'll usually dock this somewhere around maybe the left or right side of my screen, as you can see here. And then I'll go ahead and add our AC in here just so that we have easy access to them. And we could keep this in mind as we are creating our scenarios. So as I said, get that background information that you need in order to successfully test your story. In this case, I did find an article by Never Bounce that really describes what goes into making a username, what goes into making a domain name, and what goes into making a top-level domain. So if you don't know all of these aspects of a story, it's best to find them out before you really start testing. So as you can see here, the username portion here can be up to 64 characters long. And then it can also be any combination of letters, numbers, or other 7-bit ASCII special characters. And then periods are also accepted in the local part, provided they're not the first or last character and they aren't consecutive. So when we're reading through this or looking at our background info to the story, we should start seeing a lot of scenarios jumping out at us. So two very easy ones right off the bat: min and max characters. So if we've got a maximum 64 characters, we should be testing, we should really be, and I'll just put username here. So we're going to want to test minimums and maximums. And then, as I said here, so 64 characters, so minimum would be 1, maximum would be 64. And then we'd also want to test 0 characters and 65. Once again, these are so if we're below the minimum, we should receive an error. If we're above the maximum, we should also receive an error. And then the other pieces of the username that really jumped out at me, you should be able to consist of any combination of letters, numbers, or other 7-bit ASCII special characters. So we will also want to test only letters, only numbers, And then we'll also want to test only 7-bit ASCII characters. So we should be able to enter singularly these characters, but we should also be able to enter a combination. So in this case, I would test a username that has letters, numbers, and the special characters. If that works, you know the combination of letters and numbers and letters and special characters and numbers. All those combinations typically work if you cover that more broad test case. So you don't necessarily need to go through and really test every nuanced scenario that you can come up with if you can find a scenario that'll cover all three of them at once. So that really covers this first sentence here. And then we also need to make sure that we can use periods. And then I'll usually put allowed, or maybe valid would be a better term here. That way when we're going through and leveraging this document, we'll go ahead and know which are valid and which are invalid. And then we can kind of bucket our test cases around what's valid and or what are our positive scenarios and what are our negative scenarios. We've got periods. They're accepted in the local part, but they cannot be the first or the last character, and they cannot be consecutive. So there's another 3 scenarios that we really need to test in order to ensure that our email validation is working properly. That does cover all of the scenarios that are part of the username part. So now we can go ahead and move on to the domain name portion. So as we can see with the domain name, it does have stricter guidelines. So that right there jumps out at me as a tester that we should have probably more scenarios than we saw up here. First one being that it can't be more than 255 characters in length. So that will be our overall maximum characters for the domain name. So we'll go ahead and test the min and the max again. So anything between 1 character and 255 should be valid. 0 and 256 characters, though, that will be an invalid entry and should throw an error. And then right here, it must match the requirements for a host name. And names, so host names must be fewer than 63 characters long and can contain letters and numbers and hyphens. So right here, we've got quite a few scenarios that we need to test. So a domain or a host name can only be up to 63 characters long. So this will be, I'll add a note here, overall domain name length. So we really have kind of 2 sets of mins and maxes here. So host name, which per the acceptance criteria, that would be the domain name, host name, domain name, synonyms in this case with top level domain. So that would be .com, .net, so on and so forth. But anyways, 63 characters long. So right here we should have 1 to 63 valid. Once again, 0 or 64 invalid. And then we should also have Latin letters and numbers of 0 to 9 and hyphens. So letters, numbers, so we'll just copy paste that down here. Hyphens are valid, and then we can do other special characters. Maybe the caret key. So we might test a few of these. There are diminishing returns to testing, so we might not test all of them, but at least test as many as you need to feel confident that the email validation is working properly. And as you can see here, if you're reading this on your own and you're saying, well, 63 plus maybe up to 3 or 5 characters for the top level domain isn't adding up to 255 characters. So that means that we're missing something here from this article. And I did a little bit more research on Wikipedia, and the Wikipedia article for host names indicates that the host name is concatenated with periods here. So each label, which is Wikipedia and EN, can be anywhere from 1 to 63 characters. Means that we have a few additional scenarios that we can cover in here. So that would mean that we've got 2 labels, or more than 1 label. So this would be host.host.host.tld, just as an example. So each one of these should be between 1 and 63 characters. So a host, and then also the wiki said that the periods do count towards your 255 character limit here. So that's just an example of kind of reading the acceptance criteria, or what could be deemed part of the acceptance criteria, and then needing to either ask your business analyst or do additional digging to understand where this discrepancy is, 63 characters versus 255. So now that we've got that covered, I think that covers most of our domain name pieces. And then, of course, the @ symbol. This is another very important component of an email. Make sure that the @ symbol is required. And then we'd also try and submit an email with no @ symbol. And then that should throw an error. And then the .com, .org, .net. All of these are dictated by Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. So in this case, you'd go to ICANN and identify what is a valid and what is an invalid top-level domain. So I think most developers in this case would just go based on the period and then looking for letters after that period to determine if it's a valid email or not. So they're not going to go through the effort typically of compiling a list of all the valid top-level domains and putting those into an array and messing around with that with their regex. As I hope you can see, the acceptance criteria here might have been really simplistic to just validate that an email address can be entered in the expected format. But as you can see, there are a lot of scenarios that we have to cover in order to make sure that this one-liner actually works. And one of the most important parts about being a tester is being able to look at our acceptance criteria and pick apart exactly what we should be testing and what our scenarios need to be. Because there's a lot of, even though, just as an example, 64 characters long, out of that one example came 4 scenarios. So we've got to be able to really analyze what needs to be done based on the verbiage that's in our acceptance criteria. And usually that means that we'll have to have follow-up conversations with the business analyst and with project owners and project managers and just subject matter experts to ensure that we have thought of all the scenarios that we can think of. So with that being said, now that we have our high-level scenarios, we can go ahead and jump into creating those in AccelaTest. So at this time, I'll jump over into our AccelaTest program, and you can go ahead and set up your very own account. It is free, so go ahead and set up an account so that you can follow along and do the test cases too. So we'll jump into creating our tests for email test case validation right now using AccelaTest. We'll cover 2 main ways of creating our test cases, either the traditional action expected result, along with the BDD or Gherkin syntax for creating test cases. I personally prefer the Gherkin syntax for functionality like this, while I prefer the traditional test case management for more of our screen layout and look and feel of a screen, and then also just documentation in general. So we'll go through creating it both ways, but we'll first start with traditional. So we'll create a test case here. We'll give a descriptive name. So we'll just name it email validation test cases. You'll want probably a more descriptive name. In AccelaTest, you choose which type you're wanting. So we'll go with traditional, and we'll give it a status of new. And then over here on steps, we'll go ahead and select add step. And then we'll go ahead and use Facebook as our example for creating these test cases against. So our action would be to navigate to https www.facebook.com. So these first two steps are just about navigation and really landing on that sign up screen. And then on this next step, we can go ahead and get into those test cases that we had documented over here. So in this case, we're going to use a parameter of email address. So enter email address in the mobile number or email field. In my personal syntax, anytime that we're talking of an actual field name, I usually bold this. Some teams might underline it, some teams might italicize it, might put it in brackets. Kind of those standards are up to your team. Definitely establish them. And if you haven't checked out the best practices for how to create test cases yet that we've put out, you should probably check that video out. It'll help you accelerate your testing and make sure that you're following really best standards for testing and getting the most that you can out of your test scripts. So anyways, we'll enter our email address, its parameter, and then what are our expected results. So here we'll just put is error thrown. And this will just be used for documentation on if we're expecting an error or not. Some teams will stipulate the exact error that they should see. In my experience, that hasn't been value add. It's more important that an error is thrown than that we document what the error actually is. So I just simply state yes, one is thrown, or no, one is not thrown. We can go ahead and look at our scenarios over here. So we're going to want to test the max and the min. So first one might be, and we might actually want to also add a what is tested, and then this will just be for documentation because we've got a lot of scenarios that we're going to plug into this parameter here, these parameters. So it'll help if we have what is tested or what this exact line is for each of these parameters. So we'll go ahead and keep that. And then we'll go ahead and grab this, pop that over here. Get a little bit smaller so that we can just more easily see it. Test minimums. So this might be at a.com. And this really tests then, in this one scenario, we're testing our username can have a character of 1. The domain name can have a character of 1, and then also that we have a valid top-level domain, and the @ symbol is required. So this one test scenario here covers multiple scenarios over here that we'd come up with, and then we are not expecting an error to be thrown, so we'll type in is not. And then we add a new parameter row, and then we'll just do test maximums. And then in this case, we're going to need separate iterations for each of these, or step iterations for each of these scenarios, so that we know what is actually causing the error. So in this case, we might do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. You get the idea, up to, as we said here, 64. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then we do 0, 1, 2, 3, an additional 4, so we're up to 64 characters now. And then I would usually put a W or just some other character to signify which character it is that should be the issue. And then because we validated that A.com is a valid domain up here, in this first scenario, I'd use A.com as the example. And then we are expecting an error. So in this case, an error is thrown because we have 64 characters. And then the next one would be testing the domain maximum. Once again, and then I would just copy out these characters because we've already established 63 is valid, 64 is invalid. So we would copy this, paste it, and then we just get rid of one of our other digits there. So we would expect an error to be thrown because we have too many characters in our domain name there in the label. And some people might prefer to create all of your happy path or positive scenarios in a test case and all your negative scenarios in a test case. I'll leave that up to you to decide how you want to break that up. Some people like them all to be in one test case, so it's easy to maintain. Some like it to be in separate test cases. In this case, we'll just go ahead and pile them all into this one test case for simplicity's sake. And then we'll go ahead and add an X to these once we have validated them. And really, we should have leveraged what we had here with test minimums and then test maximums. So this one, go ahead and get rid of one of those characters. So in this case, it should be okay because we have 64 characters. So we have our 1 and our 64 character tested now. So that's done, and then we need to test our 0 and 65. So we've tested our 65. We need to add a test case for our 0. So this would just be @ and then A.com. We're expecting an error to be thrown. So we have tested that now. And then we can go ahead and test only numbers. And then only those ASCII special characters. And then I'm going to have to cheat for this and search Google to identify exactly what those characters are. And then we'll also want to cheat and search Google for anything that is not a 7-bit ASCII special character. And then in this case, I would just stipulate any of the codes from, and I'd leave it up to the tester to go grab some of those and just test them. So this article does document which characters to use. So we could use a colon, semicolon, less than, equal then, or equal sign, question mark, @ symbol, any of those. But these do have special characters up here, such as start of text. We might want to test that. Null character, might want to test that. These are kind of edge cases. I doubt many developers would add kind of sanity checks for this, but it doesn't hurt to check and raise any issues that might come up with it. And then we do at a.com again, and then we are not expecting an error. And then we go ahead and add maybe 8-bit ASCII characters. And then once again, I just searched Google and found ASCII-code.com. And then we are expecting an error to be thrown in this case. So we've done 7-bit ASCII characters. Now we need to do letters, numbers, and special characters. So in this case, ABC123 colon, and we might even throw a period in there just so that we can validate periods are allowed. IX at a.com, and we are not expecting an error to be thrown in that case. So we have then validated special characters, and we also validated username with a period is allowed. And then we have 3 scenarios to test, 3 negative scenarios. So first character, period as the first character shouldn't be allowed, so period a at a.com, expecting an error. In this case we have a period a at a.com. We should see an error thrown. So we've done first period or first character, 2 consecutive periods, and then we'll do the last character next. Once again, last character being a period should throw an error, so a period at a.com should throw an error. And then with that, we have validated all of the username scenarios when we do run these tests. So at this point, once again, it depends on how your team is breaking up test cases. You might create a separate test case just for the domain name portion. Personally, I would just continue putting them in here so that all of the documentation around email validation is contained within one test case. So we'll get started by validating the host here of 1 to 63 characters. So what we might do up here, we did manage to grab 0 to 64 characters here, so we just go ahead and copy that and then come down here, and that would be 64 characters instead of 63. I mean, I kind of like to start out with happy path first, so maybe do 63 characters in the domain portion just to validate labels. And then we can go ahead and duplicate that. And then we can validate that max plus 1. So adding a 2 there should throw an error. So then we have validated 63 and 64. And we'll go ahead and validate the minimum. 1 character. And then no characters. And then as you can see here, if you are copying from step iteration to step iteration, make sure you update all your parameters that need to be updated. Don't just update the one, because that would have been a bug with the test case. So we have validated then 1 and 63 and 0 and 64. Next we can do only letters, only numbers, hyphens. So you get the idea. So we'll go through each one of these test scenarios and just document them in our test case, and then next we'll go ahead and execute these test cases. And once again, for the special characters, we'll only want to test a few of these, but each one that we do test should be tested in isolation, because say for example a question mark was allowed or accepted, but a colon wasn't. If you combined question mark and colon in the same exact test, then you will end up missing a bug, because if the question mark was accepted and the colon wasn't, you combine them both, obviously that test case would fail and you wouldn't know which one caused the issue, so it would result in more testing. So you could combine them, and then if it does fail, go through and figure out exactly which character was causing the failure, or in this case, the registration to go through. But typically, with those kind of edge cases, I would prefer to test individually. But once again, for this one, I wouldn't go into that sort of detail for this exact scenario. And then the 255 maximum amongst all the labels, we'll want to go ahead and test this too. So to test the 255 characters is valid and we can combine multiple labels, we'd want to do 3 labels that have 63 characters plus the period would make 64 characters. And then we would add an additional label, so a 4th label of 60 characters. And then we'd go ahead and add our top level domain of .com. So we'd go ahead and enter that into the parameter, and then we'd also go ahead and bump that up to make, instead of 60 characters, 61 characters, to test pushing it over that 255 limit and see what happens. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we would need to remove 4 characters in order to make a 60. Add the .com and add the username. So in this case, an error should not be thrown. And then if we go ahead and bump this up by 1 character there, that should push us over the edge. So then we would be testing 256 characters. So then that should cover more than 1 label, and then also the 256 characters. And then we have verified already in practically every test case that the @ symbol is required whenever an error is not thrown. And then we can go ahead and test this last scenario of no @ symbol. It should throw an error. And then in that case, an error should be thrown. And then we would just go ahead and double check all these, make sure they're all checked off. And then once we've validated that, we can go ahead and save this test case. And then we can get into creating the Gherkin scripts. In this case, they're going to be almost identical. Just the syntax here is going to change. The reason I like Gherkin is it really documents with minimal detail, other than the required details, what needs to be done, and then what the expected result after you do those actions is. So we'll begin writing our test case in the Gherkin syntax. So once again, we'll just create a new test case, give it a nice name like email validation test cases, give it a status, and then choose BDD. And then for our inputs, so given we have an email address of, and then add email address. So we'll use parameterization again. We've got a parameter for email address. That's the input. The action we plan on taking, or the when, is when we submit the Facebook form. So when the Facebook form is submitted, and then the outcome that we're expecting, then an error So then an error, and then the parameter for is or is not thrown. And the reason I like the Gherkin syntax a lot better, you're not describing the nitty-gritty of the screen, you're just describing the actions or the inputs that you need to take, the action, and then finally what your expectation is. So this makes writing test cases much faster and more efficient, in my opinion. And the teams that we've used this on in the past have done really well in catching bugs and defects before they reach production. And then you're also speaking a common language amongst your developers, your business people, and the testers. You can hand these scripts over to a business person and they could say, yep, that's right, or nope, that's not right. A lot easier than if you were to hand over a traditional test case where they'd have to go step by step. So this is a great way to talk business language with folks. That's why I prefer Gherkin scripts for documenting functionality. And then one key difference between the traditional test cases and the Gherkin script here that we're looking at, we'll be using the data-driven iterations down here. For the traditional test case, because we stuffed both parameters in one single statement on email address and then whether an error is thrown, we were able to use a step iteration. When we go to execute this test case, we really need to be using the data-driven iteration so that it'll display given when then all of our parameters, and then you go on to the next iteration and it displays given when then again in all parameters. And you'll see this a little bit later when we get into executing these tests. But so I did open up another tab, and we'll just copy out the syntax here for email addresses and whether an error is thrown, because the test cases will be exactly the same, or the parameters that we're using in here. Really what's changing is the syntax documentation syntax. So action, expected result versus the statements. So there we have it, 26 scenarios, and there are a few that I missed. So I want you to go through and understand which scenarios I may have missed. There are a couple that I've thought of since we originally filmed this. But as you can see, the Gherkin syntax, it yields the same results as the traditional test case, but the differences are you can really hand this over to a business person and they'll be able to tell you whether your tests are right or wrong. So that's definitely a benefit to the Gherkin script syntax. So we'll go ahead and save this, and then we'll jump into actually going through and executing the tests and kind of the next steps after you've created your test cases. So after we've created our test cases, the next step in the process should be completing a 3Amigo session. A 3Amigo session is when you get the business analyst that wrote the story, the developer, and yourself together into a meeting or into a room. And what you do is you discuss your test cases, what you plan on testing, what your understanding of the story was, and then you just go through and walk through your test case so that the developer knows what you're going to be testing, the business analyst knows what you're going to be testing, and it's really just a brainstorming session after you've created your test cases to make sure we're all on the same page and we won't have any miscommunication or misunderstanding once we get into the testing phase after the code has been pushed. So the next step in the process would be the developer goes and writes the code for the story that you're working on. Once they have developed the code, they pushed it into the test environment and they've checked it into the repo, I'll go and actually look at this code and just see what I can find without ever actually touching the UI or the API layer. So just as an example, we'll say that this regex for email validation here on Stack Overflow was the code that they implemented. Right here off the bat, I could tell that if I were to do a leading period and then an @ symbol, this regex would validate as being true. So then that's a bug because you can't have a leading period. And then also you need to have a domain name, and this doesn't check that. So there's two bugs right there just by looking at their code that you might be able to find. So that's why I think it's very important that testers get familiar with reading code and then just being able to analyze it so that you can tell what you need to test and what you might not need to put as much energy behind. And then finally, after you've reviewed the code, the next step is to actually execute your test cases. So within AccelaTest, you can click the execute test and then run test execution button. And then this will pull up our test case. So I already navigated to Facebook, that passed. I clicked the create new account button, and then this will show you, this grid shows you all the scenarios that we're going to be testing with this test case. And then if we scroll down here, you'll actually see our test and then pass, fail. So we'll just select a few of these to test. You get the idea. You'd go through each of them and test each of them in entirety. So we'll just select a few of these to test. No need to go over all of them. Yep, so at a.com throws an error. We'll just randomly select a few more. A period at a.com throws an error. So this one passed, and then we'll do multiple periods in a row. And I suppose we probably should have started with the happy path just to make sure that the code is working well. So we'll just do a at a.com. And you can see that it does accept a at a.com. So no error is thrown. That passes. That's really the first test that you should start with. If that fails, there's huge problems in the system, and it really wouldn't make sense to continue testing. So always test your happy path and make sure that works first before jumping into your negative scenarios. Let's test this multiple labels. See if that one causes any issues. Seems like Facebook's algorithm, their regex here is pretty pretty buttoned up. I don't know if we'll find any bugs here. So that just verified that both of these are working. Yeah, I'm thinking we're not going to find any bugs here. So we'll just pretend like one of these failed. So if you've got a failed step, you'll mark it failed, and then you can add notes on why it failed. So this is a quick documentation that you can use whenever you're testing or when you're speaking to the test run to your colleagues. And then after you fail the test, of course, you're going to want to go create a bug in your bug management system. So we'll just pretend like we've passed everything else. We'll finish the test run. Mark this one as failed because we're pretending like that one step failed. And then you can look at your report to understand where we're at with testing. So we still have 2 tests in the directory. 1 test was ran. It didn't pass. 50% of all test cases in this directory have been executed. And then I do want to briefly touch base on executing the Gherkin scripts because we made use of the test case iterations. It will have a slightly different look and feel. So we'll just go ahead and execute it. Then as you can see here, we have 1 test per iteration instead of having all of them in one giant bundle. So you go through and mark each one of these as pass or fail. And then up here where it says data-driven iterations, you just move on to the next one. And that's the only difference for execution. And if you use test case iterations or data-driven iterations, you'll use the same functionality here to move through each of your iterations. And then you'll mark pass or fail. So once again, we'll mark this one as fail just to be consistent with the other one that we ran. After watching this how-to, I hope you have the confidence to move forward in testing your application's email fields. A few additional topics to keep in mind are that you should always run the same set of tests directly against your application's API because your UI is not a secure layer. So you need to make sure that your API is secure. UI can be circumvented easily, so always test your API. And then also inquire about what libraries the developer is using. So for this kind of functionality, your developer really should be using a library. So if they're using a fully vetted library, the rigor of your testing will be different. And then finally, we do welcome all feedback that you have on the AccelaTest application and how it can be improved, or how this video can be improved. So please do reach out to us at bugbanishers@AccelaTest.com or leave a comment below. Thank you for watching and happy testing.